Good morning. My name is Jennifer Wistrand, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of possibilities and pitfalls in the US-Kazakhstan relationship. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on the Kennan Institute's activities by visiting the Kennan Institute's website and subscribing to our blogs, podcasts, and other publications. Today's guests are Dr. Yerkin Tukumov, Dr. Shalkar Nursitov, and Dr. Suzanne Loftus. Dr. Yerkin Tukumov has an MA from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a PhD in political science. He's the author of the book, Discovering America, A View from Kazakhstan, as well as numerous academic journal articles. Yerkin is the director of the Kazakhstan Institute for Strategic Studies under the President of the Republic of Kazakhstan. He previously served in Kazakhstan's diplomatic corps, where one of his appointments was Minister Counselor of the Embassy of Kazakhstan in Russia. Dr. Shalkar Nursitov has a BA in political science from Al-Farabi Kazakh National University and an MA in media and strategic communications from George Washington University. Shalkar's research interests include political rhetoric, lobbying, propaganda, political regimes in Kazakhstan and Central Asia, and US-Kazakhstan relations. Shalkar is the executive director of the Center for Policy Solutions, which examines socioeconomic issues across Kazakhstan. Dr. Suzanne Loftus has a PhD in international studies from the University of Miami. Her areas of expertise are Russian foreign and domestic policy, Russian nationalism and national identity, post-Soviet studies, and great power competition. Suzanne's most recent book, Russia, China, and the West in Post-Cold War Era, The Limits of Liberal Universalism, analyzes great power relations over the past 3 decades and assesses the normative and structural factors that have led to today's confrontational geopolitical environment. Suzanne is currently a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. After our guests speak, there will be a question and answer period. If you'd like to ask a question, please submit your question via the Q&A function on Zoom, and please remember to include your name and affiliation when doing so. Finally, today's discussion is being recorded. So as you can see, we have an absolutely esteemed panel of guests here today, and we're going to spend the first half asking them some questions before we open to questions from the audience. So the first question I'd like to pose is to Yerkin. Yerkin, you've had a career that spanned academia, think tanks, and government. Could you please describe for us how governmental officials and experts view the Kazakhstan-US relationship? What are the strengths in this relationship, and where might there be some weaknesses?
Well, again, hello everyone. Hello Jennifer, Susan, Shalkar. Again, it's nice to see you again. Thank you for having me today, and I think that our topic raised a huge interest, partly because I think there is new opportunities to our relationship between Kazakhstan and the United States. Let me begin with the fact that even though I'm a director of Kazakhstan Institute for Strategic Studies under the president, I'm not representing an official position, and this is a completely expert and even completely my position, my view. But I, with a great pleasure, try to explain the official position. So, answering the question, what are the main strengths and main weaknesses in our relationship, I would start with the fact that over the past 30 plus years, Kazakhstan and the US built a strong partnership. And tested by time, this partnership excels at all areas, including but not limited to politics, trade and investment, defense and security, culture and education, climate and environment, critical minerals and transport and infrastructure. So we have a broad range of areas to cooperate between the two countries. And that's embedded in the enhanced strategic partnership status that Astana and United States and Washington established 6 years ago. And to date, Kazakhstan remains the only country in its part of the world that enjoys a special bond with the United States. And with this in mind, I think it's high time for the United States to play its own prominent role by strengthening the ties with Kazakhstan, the region's largest economy by far, and Central Asia overall. The added urgency to this effort is given by the upcoming US election in November 2024 this year, and the impact this may have on the composition and the priorities of the new US administration. And Kazakhstan is also in the process of change. And January events back in 2022 became a new milestone for our society. Some believe the ongoing political reforms are just a small screen, while others demand more radical steps. From my perspective, the most important thing is that Kazakh society is changing. We see the increased demand for justice and transparency, democracy and growth. And if we look from demographic perspective, today the average age of Kazakh citizens 32 years, which means that the majority of our citizens were born after the collapse of Soviet Union, and they have completely different mindset, completely different mentality. And isn't it the right time for us to start thinking about new chapter in Kazakhstan-American relations? And talk about strengths. I would start with the positive sides. First of all, we have a similar vision on non-proliferation issues, and overall on security and counterterrorism. And for me personally, I think that in our quite short history of our relationship, we don't have any dark side stories. So it is, I mean, there is no any obstacles to enhance and improve our relationships. And for me as an expert, it is crucially important that Kazakhstan has always encouraged the strengthening of cultural and educational ties with the United States. So every year, about 1,500 young Kazakhs participate in the work and travel program. Under the Bolashak program, our students basically prefer American universities. So, for example, this academic year, almost 500 students are studying in the United States out of 1,000 scholarship recipients. And the government does not restrict Kazakhstanians in their choices. So, despite the geographical distance, the US has always been and will remain our partner of choice. Even a personal relationship is a work in progress. And if we turn to weaknesses, so first, I think that an upgrade of dialogue is needed. For many years, Kazakhstan has been regarded in US politics as an object through the prism of the crisis in Afghanistan, through the lens of Russia-US relations, through the lens of US-China relations, and never regarded as a subject. So it's maybe it's good time to shift from object to subject in our policy. So, for example, last year there was just numerous of visits made by the leaders of Russia and China to Kazakhstan, and only one personal meeting with between the two presidents of United States and Kazakhstan. So we talk a lot, but rarely meet. So, but personal relations really matters. Second, business first. Over the past year, the significance of the US for Kazakh business has much increased. I would like to provide a simple example. PricewaterhouseCoopers recently conducted a survey of executives of large companies in Kazakhstan. And the question was, which three countries do you consider the most important for the income growth prospects of your company in the next 12 months? So over the years, the significance of the United States has sharply increased. So for example, in 2023, it was 31%. This year, 42%. So this research made by PricewaterhouseCoopers again. So the formal business first should remain a priority. I believe that the recent B5+1 forum will contribute to break down barriers between Central Asia and US businesses. At the same time, we should keep in mind that Kazakhstan is sanctioned, sandwiched, and landlocked. That means that geopolitical reality, this comes at a high price for us. First and foremost, Kazakhstan is losing jobs. And consequences that, according to the World Bank's calculation, by 2029, Kazakhstan will have 1 million more job seekers than in 2022. So comparing with a kind of pre-war era. So the US, from my point of view, again, should recognize the cost for sanctions. So for sanction compliance and explore innovative ways to assist Central Asian economies. And third, the last but not least, and this is especially important for me as a director of the institute, that second track diplomacy is not working properly. I mean, between the two countries. So we have a lack in expertise. For example, in our institute, we conduct just numerous meetings with expert meetings, roundtable discussions with experts from China, Russia, Central Asian, Caucasus. Like every year, I have dozens and dozens invitations to participate in different conferences in those countries. But how many do you think I got invitation from United States? Zero. It means that maybe, I mean, let be sincere with this fact that I see, or we see, it's just there is no interest for experts kind of dialogue between the two countries. And maybe along with C5+1 dialogue and B5+1 dialogue, we need to think about think tank dialogue. I mean, C5+1 think tank dialogue. That's already established between, let's say, between China and Kazakhstan, between Kazakhstan and Russia, between Central Asian countries itself. So it's it would be a good pillar to enhance our relationship between the two countries. I mean, that's all for now, and I'm ready for the next question. But
no, thank you, Yarkin. Thank you. That was, thank you, extremely helpful, I think, for audience members. And the takeaway, one of the big takeaways, it's heartening to hear that you think as of right now, there's no negatives, right, per se, in the relationship, and it can improve. But very points well taken. You know, I liked how you outlined object versus subject, right? Like moving from object to subject, and also, you know, strengthening the track to diplomacy. Excellent point. So we'll pick that up. I'm going to move first to a question for Shalkar and then Suzanne, but then circle back with you, Yarkin, on some of those points. Shalkar, I want to ask you the next question, building on, you know, what Yarkin's just outlined. You know, we've seen, he's talked about kind of, you know, Kazakhstan vis-a-vis Central Asia, broader Central Asia. So we've seen in a very short period of time, Central Asia has witnessed and been directly impacted by the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So two big events. How have these events, whose repercussions are still ongoing, impacted the Kazakhstan-US relationship?
So first of all, Jennifer, I'd like to thank you and the Kennan Institute for having me on this distinguished panel. It's my pleasure. And also, I like to make a kind clarification. First of all, you called me Dr. Shalkar Nurseitov, but unfortunately, I'm not holding a PhD degree right now. But after calling me Dr. Nurseitov, I must pursue a PhD degree as soon as possible. Yeah, so regarding your question, after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, there had been great concerns among Central Asian political elites, policymakers, businesses, experts, even among citizens about the US and Central Asia, about US and Kazakhstan relationship, since the region and Kazakhstan have been considered by the United States as a reliable partner for countering terrorism and supporting US policy on Afghanistan. And also, I'd like to mention that the Kazakh government, Kazakhstan, had tried also take advantage of this, of the US presence in Afghanistan by granting the United States access to two ports on the Caspian Sea for the transportation of non-military goods to Afghanistan, by offering scholarships for Afghan students, and offering humanitarian aids to the Afghan people, and also hosting events devoted to the peace and stability in Afghanistan and the whole region. I also want to mention that since 1991, as you know, the United States was the first nation which actually supported Kazakhstan independence. And since that time, energy sector has been the key area of the US and Kazakhstan cooperation. Energy giants like Chevron and ExxonMobil and other big companies have been drivers of the US and Kazakhstan US business interests in Kazakhstan. So the point I'm trying to make is that the US troops left Afghanistan, but Chevron, ExxonMobil, and other big businesses, they stayed in Kazakhstan in the region. So it means that the US presence of the US business interests in the region and in Kazakhstan mean that the bilateral and multilateral relations between the Central Asian countries and between the United States and Kazakhstan would continue. There was another reason for worries about the U.S. Engagement with Central Asian countries regarding the platform C5+1. Luckily, President Trump did not make any change to the Obama administration's policy towards region, and we still have this platform. And also last year, we saw that for the first time, as President Biden called, it was a historic moment that all this platform actually, it was a gathering at the presidential level. It means a lot for the region and for Kazakhstan also. C5+1 platform has been integral to keep US policy interests in the region. It's also worth mentioning that, unfortunately, Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, hasn't been highlighted in main strategic documents of the US foreign policy, also in documents concerning US security policy in the world. But the existence of the platform like C5+1 still gives a hope that the bilateral relationship will be boosted. Regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, yes, this war actually affected the sentiment in Central Asia towards Russia, towards Western countries. But in my view, based on my observation and analysis, I think that this war hasn't affected negatively the US and Kazakh relationships. As I mentioned, after the war last year in September, actually, for the first time, US president took part in C5+1 event. Biden reaffirmed US support of Kazakhstan's sovereignty and also other Central Asian countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is essential for our nations, since we heavily depend on Russian political influence and the economic influence of China. Although Kazakhstan is among the Putin's friends, as it was listed according to the Economist magazine, the Western partners so far, based on their statements, we can say that they are satisfied with Kazakhstan's policies and actions regarding sanctions against Russia. And even Secretary Blinken made a statement that Kazakhstan has been compliant with sanctions against Russia. But we have some facts demonstrating that Kazakhstan-based companies involved in re-export of goods, which is needed for the Russian military. Despite this fact, most likely Kazakhstan will not be subjected to so-called secondary sanctions. And also, I'd like to mention current US priorities in Kazakhstan, according to the US ambassador to Kazakhstan, Mr. Rosenblum, who highlighted in his interview this year, in the beginning of this year, that US pursues 4 main priorities in Kazakhstan. First is supporting sovereignty and territorial integrity of Kazakhstan. Second is border security and countering terrorism. And the third is boosting trade and investment. And last one is promoting human rights and the rule of law. In my view, this list shows that US interest in the bilateral relationship in the so-called third era of the US and Kazakhstan relations remains the same as they were in the first 2 eras. I mean, starting from the 1990s until beginnings of the 2000s, and from 2000s till the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And the third era is starting from the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Regarding the war in Ukraine, it's my last point. Kazakh citizens, they closely follow the news regarding Western support of Ukraine, including US support of Ukraine in this war, since they view their own security of their own country based on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Because we have heard a lot political statements from great powers. Last year, President of China, Xi Jinping, made a statement. He said China supports sovereignty of Kazakhstan. And we've heard such kind of statements from the US, including President Biden and Secretary Blinken, and also some high-level politicians from the European Union. Also, they frequently make such kind of statements regarding sovereignty and territorial integrity of Central Asian countries. So in my view, this is still important, but also promoting human rights and the rule of law should not be put at last. It should be included in the first 3 priorities, because without the rule of law, without supporting and protecting human rights, it's really hard to support Kazakhstan's sovereignty and other Central Asian countries' sovereignty, and to make sure that we have secure border, and also to boost trade and investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalkar. And I really like how you narrowed in on the 4 points that are mentioned specifically in the documents between the US and Kazakhstan. I think people are going to find that very interesting in your reordering of them. I want to turn to Suzanne for our next question. We've heard now coming from the Kazakhstan side, looking at the Kazakhstan-US relationship. I want to flip now and ask you, looking at the relationship from the US side. So based on your research and your discussions with American academics and policymakers, what are the key factors and the key debates that are influencing the development of US policy vis-a-vis Kazakhstan?
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for your question and for putting this panel together today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to answer those questions, of course. I would say that while there is broad cooperation with Kazakhstan in many different areas, the focus is primarily on economic ties and particularly the oil sector. It doesn't seem as though the United States is particularly involved in Kazakhstan's political or military affairs at this stage in history. And this is probably part of this debate that you referred to in your question about the US role in the world, about whether the US should be more actively engaged in all parts of the world, whether it should be more focused on certain key areas of concern and not try to seek this primacy everywhere that we hear about US, geopolitical interests. And it seems that the consensus on Kazakhstan is relatively clear among policymakers, as it is a country that is geographically situated between Russia and China, but quite far away from the United States, with a very particular and distinct history that is not very similar, let's say, to Western modes of development. However, the United States, of course, is concerned with the rising role of China in the region and has particularly kept an eye on the economic and energy cooperation between Kazakhstan and China. It's also very concerned with the way that China treats Uyghur Muslims in neighboring Xinjiang. But the US doesn't appear to have so much sway in these areas. There are growing ties with Kazakhstan and China, and Kazakhstan uses a lot of pragmatism to stay on good terms with China, understandably so. So, as was mentioned, following the September 11th terrorist attacks, a principal US interest in the region was countering Islamist extremism. And Kazakhstan was very cooperative with the United States in many different paths and avenues, including accepting US extremist rehabilitation programs. But since then, since the United States pulled out of Afghanistan, some have said that the interest in Central Asia has diminished. However, due to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the interest appears to have grown again in a different capacity. There is renewed interest in the area and the country as part of the United States' wider strategy against or countering Russia. And this has been reflected, for example, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's trip to the region in 2023. That was a positive development, but the critiques are that there's no real US commitment. It remains rather limited, the amount that the United States invests in the region. It could be substantially higher. So in my trip to Kazakhstan, I was lucky to be able to go there last year for a couple of weeks, and I spoke to a lot of different people. And I found that civil society activists and liberal-minded city dwellers were more inclined to have the perspective that America should be far more involved in Kazakhstan and to encourage liberal reform in the country. However, if you take the political opinions of the entire country as a whole, we may find that many are apolitical and may not have any particular affinity for the United States and even are a bit skeptical of liberal values. And this goes back to another debate that we have in the United States, is about how, quote unquote, aggressive or assertive, however you want to call it, to be in our promotion of liberal democracy abroad. We have seen in certain cases that it has been far less successful than in others. So because of this, the United States, I think, sees Kazakhstan as an area where it's not something that should be pushed aggressively, but should be lightly encouraged due to the fact that the country has its own particular history, its own institutional legacy, and its own type of leadership, where such assertive democracy promotion policies may not be welcomed right away or may take a very long time to come to fruition. Now, when it comes to Kazakhstan's goals with the United States and its relationship with the US, this would probably be prioritized as attracting more investment from the US to create a balance so that Kazakhstan is not overly dependent on Russia or China. And the trade relations between the US and Kazakhstan have grown substantially, but however, they still pale in comparison with Russia and China. Diplomatically, the US is involved, as was mentioned by both other panelists, in the C5+1 network, a diplomatic platform between the US and Central Asia. And this is the platform through which they discuss areas of mutual interest. While many have mentioned that this platform may not be a platform where very much happens and is mostly just a diplomatic club, this is a really important platform, and it should be strengthened by meeting more frequently and by implementing more joint economic projects for the region. It's important, especially at this stage after the invasion of Ukraine, that Central Asia feels that the United States is a reliable partner and an important partner that wants to increase its investments in the region towards its economic and social development. Some mechanisms, for example, like USAID, could bolster its activities and participate in development-oriented activities that would support, let's say, Kazakhstan's demographic changes, which are affecting its certain sectors of its society, such as housing, education, healthcare, and transport. So investing and aiding the country towards its socioeconomic development is probably the United States' best bet when it comes to forging better relations while not becoming or creating a kind of zero-sum competition geopolitically with Russia and China in the region. So those would be my remarks. Thank you for your question.
Oh, thank you, Suzanne. I really like, again, building on Shalkar, like very concrete when you talked about just in your conclusion now, ways to forge better relations and also common goals, right? What do both sides want if they're moving forward? I want to pause quickly and remind our audience members to please submit questions you may have for either one particular guest or all three of the guests. In about 10 minutes, we'll switch over to audience questions. So please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A function at the base of your Zoom screen. And please include your name and your affiliation when you do so. So I want to do one more round of questions for our guests. And this time I'm going to ask everyone, because we're at about the halfway mark, if you can keep your comments maybe to 3 minutes, so that we've got about 20 minutes left for audience questions. But circling back, Yerkin, to you. Kazakhstan, it's long sought to chart, as you mentioned, started to get to in your original remarks, this middle ground through its multi-vector foreign policy. How has the changing geopolitical situation in Central Asia, because of Russia's, because of China's, because of Turkey's, we've not brought up Turkey yet, but some of the kind of the big powers that surround the region, how has this situation impacted Kazakhstan's ability to chart its own course? And related to this, has this had any impact on the US-Kazakhstan relationship? And if so, what kind of impact?
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. But if you don't mind, may I just make some quick remarks what Susan said about liberal democracy? I mean, this possibility of building a liberal democracy in Kazakhstan. Now, well, when I compare this possibility, or again, there is a huge discussion right now in Kazakhstan. They call it as a post-colonial discussion, how we can get lost out of our, this colonialism, Soviet colonialism, it would be better, I think, compare us as Kazakhstan society with other post-communist societies, like, for example, Polish society. Why Polish? I spent over 6 years in Poland. I made it there, my bachelor degree, so I little bit know Polish reality, and I'm just wondering when they changed their government from liberal one to conservative one back in 2004, it doesn't mean that they rejected liberal norms or liberal democracy. They rather, I mean, they stayed for freedom, for freedom of speech, for democracy, but they really needed their they try to find their identity. So when we're discussing Kazakh traditions or Kazakh norms, it doesn't mean that when you making a polls and asking, are you in favor of liberal democracies norm or liberal norms? If they say no, it doesn't mean they rejected freedom of speech or democracy itself. So there is a tricky thing, but when we're exploring our traditional norms, they are not contradicting to democracy. They are not contradicting to liberal norms. So it's a huge kind of understanding right now who we are as a nation, how we transforming from traditional one to modern society one. And I really like it that we started these debates in Kazakhstan. That was, I mean, January events kind of a wake-up call for the whole society, not only for the government. So it's a kind of good ground to discuss who we are and why do we need relations with the United States, meaning the geographical factor, etc. And back into this, to your question, Jennifer, I'm sorry, I'm taking your time.
No. I'm actually very glad you brought up this discussion, and this is great to have the back and forth. But yeah, no, if you just want to quickly touch on the question, and that's okay.
Of course, just 2 minutes. I wouldn't say that the war has not any impact on Kazakh-US relationship. But I really like it what David Cameron, foreign minister, foreign secretary of British government, yesterday said about British and Kazakh relationship, saying that we understand that geography matters for Kazakhstan. We are not saying that you have to make a choice, but he said very important words that we are here. I mean, meaning Great Britain, we are here, so you have a choice. So it's a good point. Do not push us to take a side, but it is great that the United States understand that we do not take a side because geography matters, but United States is a choice, and we really appreciate that we have a choice in this regard. So I will stop on that, and I would like to jump in any moment.
No, that's fantastic, Yerkin. And I think actually in just scanning some of the audience questions that are coming in, we're going to circle back again to, as all of you have touched on, right? Kazakhstan's geography, which you can't ignore, and it shouldn't be ignored. But choice, I really liked your use of the word there. One more question for Shalkar and one more for Suzanne before we do have about 15 audience questions that have come in, and encourage audience members too. Please keep sending your questions in because the ones that are up here are great. Shalkar, I want to ask you another question. What's the state of the US-Kazakh relationship people have already started to touch on this, beyond the political realm. So for example, in the area of economics and human rights, which you talked about last time when you were naming those 4 points, did the January 2022 events in Kazakhstan impact the Kazakhstan-US relationship in any meaningful way? And maybe I'll just ask you, again, I know I've asked you to keep your remarks just a couple of minutes, but maybe if we have some audience members who don't know what took place in January 22, can you just kind of briefly summarize for them so they understand why we keep referencing this?
Okay, sure. First, Kazakhstan is a main top US business partner in Central Asia. Last year, their bilateral trade reached $3.7 billion US. And also last year, US made $5 billion US, $5 billion US for direct investment in Kazakhstan's economy. If you look at, this is a huge numbers if you look at from the Kazakhstan's perspective, but on the other hand, from the US perspective, this is not huge numbers. Kazakhstan is the 81st largest trading partner of the United States. I think this number says a lot by itself. Although Kazakhstan has not been lifted from the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, there is no serious political and economic barriers for bilateral trades and doing businesses for the US and Kazakhstan companies in the respective countries. Again, energy sector remains the core of the US and Kazakhstan economic relationship. For example, Chevron has an 18% stake in Karachaganak, and ExxonMobil has 70% of Kashagan. So energy sector remains the main area of economic cooperation. But $3 billion US, it's again, it's not a huge number if you compare the US Kazakhstan's trade with China, with the EU and Russia, and that there is a more should be done in terms of bilateral trade and bilateral economic relationships. Regarding January events, so 2 years ago, in January 2022, there was a massive protest across Kazakhstan, which started from the western part of Kazakhstan and reached other regions of Kazakhstan in a couple of days. This event shook the Kazakh society, shocked the international community, and also made changes to the power balance in the Kazakhstan's political elite, in particular between power balance between former president Nursultan Nazarbayev, who remained as a father of the nation, as Yelbasi from March 2019 until June 2022, and he actually had a huge influence on Kazakh politics. But things changed after January events. President Tokayev has consolidated the political power in his hands, and he has become the leading figure in Kazakhstan's politics. Unfortunately, during the January events, at least 238 people died. They were killed, actually. And unfortunately, we haven't heard harsh critiques from the democratic nations. They made a statement that they're concerned about the situation in Kazakhstan, but in my view, these statements, including from the US government, were soft enough. It is incomparable to what happened in Kazakhstan in January 2022. And also, unfortunately, we didn't hear during the Secretary Blinken's visit last year. He visited Kazakhstan, and during his public statements, he actually didn't make any statement on the January events, because I know that many journalists, they wanted to hear some comments from the Secretary Blinken regarding the bloody January events of 2022. And also, after January events, the number of political prisoners in Kazakhstan has increased, according to some human rights activists and human rights organizations, 11 times. And nowadays, we have around 25 political prisoners in Kazakhstan. For your information, this year, Kazakhstan lifted Taliban from the list of terrorist organizations. But according to human rights organizations and activists, the Kazakh government utilized the so-called extremism articles in the crime code of Kazakhstan against civic and political activists. So in my view, US government and other democratic governments should be cautious while praising Central Asian and Kazakhstan's governments for their cosmetic reforms in the political system, because such kind of diplomatic actions, statements, embolden democratic autocratic governments in our region. For example, in 1999, President Bill Clinton awarded Nursultan Nazarbayev with a diploma for outstanding contribution to the promotion of democracy. It happened after 1995, when Nazarbayev changed the constitution and made his own constitution. And nowadays, the Western government, including US government, applaud so-called new Kazakhstan, new Uzbekistan, or new Kyrgyzstan ideas, which has really nothing to do with the improvement of human rights conditions on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalkar. I really appreciate you getting very much into human rights and just general kind of societal issues. This conversation could go on for 2 hours, I'm realizing, but we are gonna, Suzanne, I'm gonna turn to you for the last quick question. And if you can keep it just to a couple minutes, because we do have some very good questions that have come in from our audience, and I want to at least address a few of them before we run out of our time. So my last question for you builds on some of the points you started to mention in your last answer, where you started talking about USAID and others. So building on the earlier question, I just want to quickly ask you, what do you think are some of the blind spots in the development of US policy toward Kazakhstan? Do these blind spots tend to fall? Is it in the defense realm? Is it in the development realm? Is it the diplomacy realm? Where exactly do you think we should fine-tune things?
So while I wouldn't say that there are overt blind spots, there are areas that the US really needs to stay mindful of. And this, again, has a lot to do with Kazakhstan's regional relationships. So, for example, it's understandable that it will mostly refrain from voting with the United States at the United Nations if it's against Russia and China, just to, as a hedge against its own security, to protect itself. And, or for example, US efforts to push Kazakhstan to denounce Chinese human rights abuses. While, yes, of course, there are blatant human rights abuses, the government hasn't done that and probably won't do that. So these are just things to observe. And there's also a very interesting kind of delicate balance about different ethnic groups in Kazakhstan that I observed while over there. And a lot of it is to just promote stability and prevent any type of ethnic tension between groups. It has quite a large Russian minority there, ethnic minority, but it has been able to avoid any type of tensions or any overt and blatant types of tension. And this may be partially because of the government's support for a multi-ethnic state. There's the difference between Kazakhstanis and Kazakhs. The Kazakhstani is like the civic embodiment of nationalism for all ethnic groups. And also the government's multi-vector foreign policy. So all this allows the country to have good relations with Russia and China and promote stability inside its borders. So that's just something that the US can also, be mindful of. There are some demographic changes, of course, very important ones within the country. And the country's ruling elite understands the popularity of rising ethnic type of nationalism, because now the population is majority Kazakhs, plus more than 70%. When the fall of the Soviet Union happened, it was more half Kazakh half Russian. Of course, there's plenty of other ethnicities, but the major ones were rather equal at that time. And the current government is also remaining influenced by the legacy of Soviet culture and fears this ethnic conflict. So it tends to kind of continue to promote these policies of stability. And that's why it approaches the country with this approach of to identity-related issues, where it kind of balances the interest between the ethnic nationalist type lobbies with their own civic form of nationalism, which stems back, from Soviet times probably. And the people that I spoke to in the region tended to say that the risk of this interethnic conflict in the first decade of independence was actually mitigated by Kazakhstan's language policy. Some of them mentioned that because it constitutionally recognized Russian as an official language, it helped to mitigate any type of tension. Also, political parties in the country that are purely based on ethnicity are banned. Another, stability promoting policy. So this quote unquote Russian friendly approach, perhaps you want to call it, is just mere pragmatism to avoid conflict and instability. And that's probably also something the US needs to be mindful of. The war in Ukraine has, however, ignited worry among members of the Kazakh elite and also people in Kazakhstan that perhaps Kazakhstan might be next in the Kremlin's expansionist agenda, especially because of the pretext that it used in Ukraine, one of them, to protecting the ethnic Russian population there as a reason to invade. So, and the Kremlin has made some disturbing remarks about Kazakhstan in the past, about its statehood and its identity. And there is that fear that exists, but I wouldn't say that fear is overwhelming in the country. I would say that most actually don't see them being next because of this pragmatic, friendly approach towards Russia. But this could be changed because of this demographic trend that I mentioned. So now, because the demographics are changing substantially in Kazakhstan, and also because of Russia's demographic decline as well, we might start to see some issues boil over. That, of course, and there's other reasons for instability, but that was one example. And so just to conclude, Kazakhstan's foreign policy has so far allowed it to retain these cooperative relations with China and Russia and the US, and that allows it to continue to diversify its economy and develop. And the United States at this stage has rather minimal political influence in Kazakhstan and less involvement than China and Russia in terms of trade. But the US, it's now, it can bolster its investment in the region and bolster its economic support to aid the country's development and reform, as it already does, and perhaps just try to encourage the country to move forward in the best direction possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. We are going to now, we've only got about 7-8 minutes left, but I wanted to get a couple questions in from our audience members. Because this has been an excellent discussion. As I said, we could go on for 2 hours. So we may have to consider doing a reprisal of this and inviting our guests back again. So I want to take, let's ask our guests, maybe so that everyone can weigh in and keep your comments maybe to, the 30 to 60 second range. But we've got a question here from former U.S. Ambassador to Kazakhstan, George Kroll. Says, might the discussants comment on the state of US-Kazakhstani relations in the educational and media fields? Are educational exchanges growing or reducing, and how are the US and Kazakhstan working together to deal with media pressures from neighbors? So this is great. I know a couple of you, Yerkin, you talked about the numbers of exchanges, and Shalkar, I know you've got the background in media and strategic communications. Actually, this applies to comments all of you made. So who wants to jump in with that? Media and education.
So, go ahead.
Yeah. About, if I am not wrong, the question was how we can tackle with media pressure from neighboring countries. We are really concerned when there is some propaganda, kind of rude propaganda coming from abroad, and there is no kind of reciprocal approach to make some, again, rude words in return. We rather try to explain that there is a different reality in Kazakhstan right now, referring to the demographic change, what Susan mentioned and Schalker mentioned. I would say that in terms of understand what's going on in Kazakhstan, you need to understand our demographic shifts, that we have completely different generation after the collapse of Soviet Union, and they have no any kind of affiliation in their mind with the Soviet Union. They have different perspective on our foreign policy, on our internal policy, and they wouldn't appreciate any propaganda words coming from abroad. So it's that we're explaining to our neighbors that this is very that may negatively affect our relationship, and that's why we kept kind of discussing with our partners with those countries. We established a Kazakh-Russian platform, expert platform, just saying that about history, about our relationship, should say experts, politicians, diplomats, but not propagandists. And again, about possibility of interethnic conflicts, I would add that besides our policy, I mean Kazakh policy toward different ethnic groups, the another factor might play a huge role: the different socio-demographic structure of Russian ethnicity and Kazakh ethnicity. So the average age of Kazakh is just 23 years, but on opposite, the average age of Russians right now in Kazakhstan, it's 43. It's almost the same with which is in Russia. So it's they have different mentalities. They have different even economic niche in Kazakhstan economy. So it's there is no competition between the two groups in the market. That's also my.
No, I would say, Yerkin, this is fascinating, and I want to ask Shalkar and Suzanne to jump in too, because about on the same topic, we've got another question related to this. It says, how are interethnic relations in Kazakhstan at the moment, which you're actually talking about, which is great. So I want to build on what you said and add in this other person's question. Are there any tensions between ethnic Kazakhs and the Russian minority? When I was living in Kazakhstan, Russian Kazakhstanis were oriented toward Moscow to a substantial degree. So I think a lot of our audience members do have questions. Again, getting back to what you guys have pointed out with geography, with interethnic, Suzanne was talking a lot about the interethnic, what was the breakdown in Soviet period and now. So any of you, maybe we'll use this as our final question, spend the next couple of minutes kind of really getting down on this. What are the relations in the country? How are the relations between Kazakhstan and Russia? And then maybe kind of circling back, is that impacting US-Kazakhstani relations? So anyone feel free to jump in.
So I'd like to answer the second part of the Ambassador Crowell's questions regarding media part. So unfortunately, as I know, Kazakh government doesn't have a strategy to fight against propaganda, foreign propaganda, and misinformation. But we do have some educational training programs supported by the international organizations headquartered in the United States and the European countries who support local initiatives, local projects, basically supporting Kazakh language media projects, supporting countering propaganda coming from abroad. So unfortunately, this scope of these projects is not enough to educate majority of people of Kazakhstan who are basically vulnerable to the government and to foreign propaganda. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Shalkar. Suzanne, did you want to jump in on any of those topics?
Sure. Just when I was there, that was one of the major questions that I was asking a lot of the people that I was interviewing, is how the relations were between the ethnic Russians and the Kazakhs and other nationalities or ethnic groups, sorry. And the main conclusions that I gathered was that there's quite a separate media space between these groups. The ethnic Russian population does watch a lot more kind of Russian-oriented media and may live in a different kind of media sphere and are more inclined to receive information in a certain way. So there is that kind of separation of media. But in terms of their relations, there doesn't seem to be any overt issues. However, many of the non-Russians said that their ethnic Russians were not very well integrated into overall Kazakh society, Kazakhstani society. Can make more of an effort to learn the language, for example, and be more integrated as such. But I wouldn't say there's any real ethnic tension or strong kind of pointers in that direction at this moment.
Thank you. Yerkin or Shalkar, did each of you want to add in?
Regarding to the question, are we making a progress in our democracy? So I would say that, of course, we are just at the beginning of this road, and this is for sure, this is a bumpy road, and there is with ups and downs, and there is no guarantee, but we are on the right way, from my point. And I think it would be fair to compare Kazakhstan not with developed democracies like United States or European Union countries, but with itself, with Kazakhstan, what we used to be 2 or 3 years ago. And comparing in that way, I see a progress. So it is good that we have pluralism in this way. We have different opinions. And I appreciate what Shalkar said. I think he has his own vision. And the fact that we talking about democracy in Kazakhstan with any kind of punishment, or it is also the sign that we have on a right way to develop our democracy, freedom of speech. And it's not about only government. Again, it's all about society. That there is a different, that there is a change in our society. So it is hard not to see these changes, positive changes. I think that saying that of course that impact our relationship with the United States, and there is a huge demand to go to the United States to study, to participate in conferences, to make exchanges with experts coming to Kazakhstan and to United States, making some common research, etc. So we have to think about developing human-to-human relationship, not only in political or economics spheres, but also human-to-human relations. That's what we miss.
Thank you, Yerkin. Shalkar, did you have?
Yeah. I just wanted to add what Yerkin said. Yes, we need to boost people-to-people connection in our bilateral relationship. For example, before the Expo 2017, it was planned that we would have direct flight from Almaty to New York, but unfortunately, it's still a plan. And also, there's some data showing that last year, US embassy rejected every second H-1B visa application for Kazakh citizens. and 30% of student visa also were disapproved. I think we need to reassess people-to-people connection, and also educational programs, and also business programs, affecting business relationships, and also affecting people's travel to the United States. Unfortunately, most of Kazakh people, rely on some propaganda materials, propaganda articles depicting the picture of United States. Some because of the geography, because we're a landlocked country, there's no, it's not easy to get to the United States, but unfortunately, most people rely what they have on their cell phones, on social media, and basically they get information not in English or in Kazakh, mostly in Russian, and also it's important to pay attention to people connection. And also, I think we need to, to shift the US-Kazakhstan's relationship in the field of security and regarding sovereignty, territorial integrity of our Central Asian countries to a new level, because the stakes are so high, and the situation is so real, because we're having a war in the Europe, between the former post-Soviet countries, brother countries, and there's a potential risk for Central Asian countries also, and our dependence on the Kremlin, our dependence on the other great powers is rising. So I think as yesterday in his op-ed, David Cameron said, Kazakhstan, also other Central Asian countries, they need to have a choice, like different actors, different players in our foreign policy. So Kazakhstan, I hope that will still continue, to be more pragmatic when it comes to its foreign policy, and pursuing its so-called multi-vector foreign policy. But without having more choice, it will be tough. It will be challenging. So the policymakers, decision makers in Washington D.C. and the European Union and other democratic countries, they need to boost their presence in our region in order to have more safe, more secure, and more prosperous world, prosperous region, which should be useful, good, and for all of us.
Thank you, Shalkar. And I realize I've given Yerkin and Shalkar final comments. Suzanne, anything you want to finally add, and then we'll need to wrap up. Any final comments?
Oh, I mean, not really. I just want to say that, based on what the other two have just said, that this platform here, this conference, this virtual conference, is a way, for people-to-people contact. And I would really, also encourage having these way more frequently and to a much larger extent, and in person in Washington, D.C., or even in Almaty or Astana. That would be really interesting for everyone as well. So I hope to organize far more of these in the future. And just thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I thank all of, yes, Yerkin, did you want to, final comment?
I'm just wondering what we're gonna do with the unanswered questions.
Well, yes, we got through very few of our questions, and I will tell our audience members, if you would like your question answered, feel free to contact me at the Kennan Institute, and then I can direct the questions to our guests. Does that work for our guests?
Sure.
Great. Sure. Absolutely. So again, and I think this is the sign, taking Suzanne's comments, Yerkin talking about people-to-people, getting invitations, Shalkar, that we do need to have more conversation, right, on the human, the person-to-person about these topics in these fora and other fora as well. And so I want to thank our guests for the large number of topics they addressed today. So again, Dr. Yerkin Tukhimov, I'm going to call you again, Dr. Shalkar, since you've told us you're going to get your PhD, Dr. Shalkar Nursaitov, and Dr. Suzanne Loftus. Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you to our audience members for being here and for your questions. And again, if you would like your question answered and I wasn't able to ask it, please do contact me at the Kennan Institute and I will share it with our audience members. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank
and we
you,
look-
Jennifer.
Thank
We
you,
look
Jennifer.
forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.